Hey everyone, I am Terrius Montage Jones, and I will be doing my presentation based on Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones, and I'm using Christopher W. Clark's article, What Comes to the Surface, Storms, Bodies, and Community in Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones. All right, so one of the first points that Clark brings up is he begins by talking about a lot of like the political inertia that occurred uh, in Louisiana, Mississippi, etc., prior to Katrina, but he starts off specifically focusing on like New Orleans. So he talks about the discrimination that pre-existed from race and class. So to this, Ron Walters, who is a professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland, he stated that Black people, during Katrina, Black people were mad because they felt the reason for the slow response is because those people were Black and they did not support George Bush. Likewise, Van Jones, in his article, he talks about how the media portrayed people who were in survival mode that were Black and white. And they kind of labeled Black people as looting for food and stated that white people were finding food. There were also reports, and this is something else that Clark points out, reports that the plan with Katrina and the levees was to eliminate the homeless, the poor, sick, even the elderly. So, of course, this echoes like past legislation through such as like vagrancy codes that were aimed to keep track of, initially aimed to keep track of freedmen and restrict their movement through legalized punishment of hard labor within prison. Um, you can also tie this into the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, which is connected to the Louisiana Purchase and culminated in a lot of forced migration from southern states where ancestral land was connected to the Cherokee. But even in the Grapes of Wrath, we see John Steinbeck, he applied these same ideas. The Joe family, they represent historical law against the poor, the homeless, and even those that became migrants willingly or by some form of coercion. Steinbeck also highlights the issue of the use of land and the political and employment policies for laborers under the weight of the Great Depression. So, what we see is Clark and Ward using Hurricane Katrina in a way to kind of like emphasize the idea of a Great Depression by way of natural disaster. All right, my next point begins with the word anthropomorphization. All right, and when you think of this word, I think of personification. Anthropomorphization, it means giving a tribute or attributing human form and personality to something that is not human. So Clark, he quotes Jesmyn Ward from page 124 when she says, or when she has Esk saying, the storm, it has a name now. Like the worst, she's a woman, Katrina. All right, so the storm, well, first idea that Clark looks at is the storm, once it is betrayed as a woman, it becomes real, like something tangible for the characters. Because in the beginning, what you see is some of the characters, they didn't really think that the hurricane was going to hit as hard based on some of the past, hurricanes and news reports. This idea, though, it also hints at the female as object in the story through Katrina and the narrator. So for S, her lack of confidence, of course, it leads to her early sexual behavior. She is a willing sexual object because she seeks love from outside. As inside, she cannot love herself. And another quote from Esk is when she says, even though I knew all the other boys, I knew him, talking about Manny, and his body best, I loved him best. That's from page 16. Because of her early lack of identity, she turns to self objectification. Because her past racial history and her witness history, when history is circumscribed, teaches her to do so. She even make references to her hair, because hair is also part of identity and part of like the idea of being objectified. She says, "My hair, my pillow, in the red dirt." So, like, hair is important because she feels it is her one good quality, which also means she has bought into the stereotype that her hair is not good on its own. And then we also see the mother's death as a psychological or has a psychological toll on Esk, which forces her to reach for love through boys and sex and leading her to early sexual experiences. And this is also something that is kind of connected to what the father says and how and his comparison of Katrina, because he compares Katrina to a woman with the thought that women are the worst kinds of people. Right. And so obviously, this is kind of like sub-connected to S' view of herself. Next, Clark, he looks at the socio-political state of Mississippi, not just like during Katrina, but even before Katrina. So he also argues that Ward, by focusing her novel on Mississippi, she is attempting to remove the idea that Katrina was just a New Orleans event, because that is what comes to mind when we think of Katrina. Because I know even for myself, where I'm from, every person that I've met when they had to leave because of Katrina, they were all from New Orleans. So this kind of like puts you in the mind of Katrina, New Orleans. Even most of the media reports Katrina, New Orleans. So basically, what Ward is doing and what Clark argues is that she's personalizing Katrina to the other Gulf states that were hit hard, but namely Mississippi. She also chooses Mississippi. Well, at least Clark argues that she focuses the disaster of Katrina, not from the lens of the place that was hit the hardest, but based on the poorest state. So Mississippi's poverty rate in 2005 was over 21% of the people who fell below the poverty line. And I guess as a side note, it's good to know that after slavery, Mississippi also was the state that passed the first black code with their miscegenation laws. There was also in the probably the mid 1900s, like maybe like 1950s and up, there was a migration from Laurel, Mississippi to Erie, Pennsylvania, because of the extreme levels of discrimination, poverty, lack of opportunities, jobs, and low education in Laurel, Mississippi. All right, next, Clark. He looks at some of the aspects of media propaganda. So when he talks about media propaganda, it made me think of some of the elements of media propaganda that he kind of quotes but doesn't well, he gives examples of, but not the actual element. So when he says that, or reports that some of the people, some of the politicians, media, they were calling people who couldn't afford to like easily pack up and leave. They were calling them shiftless or stupid. And this element is what, this element of media propaganda is demonizing the enemy. And another element that is prevalent is ignoring structural causes. So in the novel, and Clark talks about the characters, they're always surrounded by a harsh environment. They live near the pit. The pit was nicknamed by Papa Joseph, who, and this is a quote from page 15, who let the white men take all the dirt they wanted until their digging had created a cliff over a dry lake in the backyard. So this entire passage, it kind of echoes Ward's underlining connections to the Jim Crow environment, where you're kind of like always living on the edge mentally, physically, politically, economically. Clark, in his article on page 344, he also quotes Ward. And again, this is from page 15. He says, when there's good rain in the summer, the pit fills to the brim and we swim in it. The water, which was normally pink, had turned a thick brownish red, the color of a scab. So again, we're looking at like Jim Crow and like the separate but equal legislation that led to, separate community swimming pools. And often, blacks didn't have an actual swimming pool in their neighborhood, so they had to get creative, even when this creativity put their health in danger. And that is like the symbolism of the scab. They also live near Dead Man's Curve. And the quote on page 31 is, he could not have known the road would curl like his streaming blood. All right. And Ward, she integrates this quote to kind of like foreshadow not just the environment that they're in, but the unpredictable storms of the Gulf and, the unpredictable nature of Katrina. Next, Clark, he has a segment on stereotypes. All right, so stereotypes. When we define stereotypes, stereotypes are something that kills an entire group of people's individuality. Clark argues that Ward uses esque to both portray stereotypes, something that we see with her early pregnancy, but as well as to contrast those stereotypes. Clark, he looks at some of the stereotypes of the South, where the South is stereotyped as working class, poor, unemployed, uneducated. Esque is used then by Ward to contrast this specifically through her various mentions of Greek mythology. So on page 163, Esque narrates, maybe Katrina is coming for us. Did media bless the heroes before they set out on their journey? Did she stand on the deck of that ship like I stand in the clearing, womanly ripe, and weave spells for rain to cloak their departure, to cloak their betrayal? And this next point, it's still connected to stereotypes. So Clark, he argues that Ward has created characters that have hybrid characteristics of the South and of other places in America. So I think one of the ideas he brings up in this section is the stereotype of the welfare queen. And this kind of made me think about the War on Poverty and the film Claudine. That was a 1974 film. But What I do know is, the welfare, some of the welfare programs during the war on poverty, um, some of these programs for the poor, they incentivized, which is rewarding the very behaviors that are most likely to perpetuate poverty, such as a disinterest in work, you get incentivized. Disinterest in school, education, creativity, critical thinking, or establishing a complete family. Those are elements where you are incentivized. So to this, Ward seems to integrate multiple characters that are either clever, have a sense of community, they are educated or at least want to be educated, and religious. So Clark, he kind of rounds this idea off by, um, I guess, looking at that positive, but also how, because of the environment, it becomes negative or can become negative. So he rounds it off by contending or hinting that desegregation, it ruptured kinship and community. And this is kind of echoed through community severance in the area known as the Pit with Ward. Her examples, you have Manny, he rejects Esk, and then Skeeta gets into a physical altercation with Rico, who is Manny's cousin. Clark also talks about the characters having a background that transcends like the cultural or socioeconomic background that most people are used to when they think about Southern characters. Um, and again, this is, for one, done through Esk viewing herself through Greek mythology. So Clark also argues that Ward does this because she is trying to make the characters more universal. Esk also has a lack of identity that is based on motherhood and the mythology that is incorporated. Clark argues as part of the crisis of selfhood, and he argues that Esk must struggle through this, identity and mythology crisis in order for her to be seen. And then finally, Clark, he writes that, and this is on page 357 of his article, characters of Salvage the Bones band together in solidarity, challenging the expected outcome of Black bodies left to perish in the South. So when we go back to the beginning, where Clark reports that the plan, or there were reports that the plan was to eliminate the homeless, poor, sick, and elderly. The banding together is kind of like community legislation challenging political legislation, and it's kind of like I guess, a boxing match of political legislation elimination versus community legislation of survival. All right, so my two discussion questions. The first one, do you see Jesmyn Ward integrating the idea of elimination or removal of underclass citizens in Mississippi due to Katrina? And the second one, Clark states that Ward focuses on the socio-political state of Mississippi. So what does Ward bring to the Katrina conversation that wasn't there before? And does this, well, at least this presentation and Clark's article, well, make should be out of there, but does this cause you to view Katrina differently? And this is a list of some of the sources that I used. And that concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have learned another tidbit about Salvage the Bones.